In the year 1600, a group of London merchants did something that seemed, at the time, entirely unremarkable. They pooled their money together. They petitioned Queen Elizabeth I for a royal charter, and they asked permission to trade spices with Asia. What followed was not unremarkable. Over the next 258 years, that modest group of merchants would build a private army larger than most nations on earth. They would conquer territories spanning from the tip of India to the edges of Southeast Asia. They would collect taxes from hundreds of millions of people. They would fight wars, broker treaties, topple emperors, and at their absolute peak, control trade routes that generated more wealth than any single entity in the history of the world. They were not a government, they were a company. This is the story of the East India Company, how it rose, how it ruled, and how it fell. To understand why this company became what it became, you first have to understand what spices meant in the year 1600. In an age before refrigeration, before any of the preservation methods we take entirely for granted today, spices were not a luxury. They were survival. Pepper could preserve meat through a winter. Nutmeg could mask the taste of food that was beginning to turn. Cloves and cinnamon commanded extraordinary prices in European markets because they were genuinely difficult to obtain and genuinely necessary to have. The trade routes that supplied them ran through the Ottoman Empire and were controlled largely by Portuguese and Dutch rivals who had no interest in sharing access. England wanted in, and so on December 31st, 1600, the last day of the century, the East India Company was born. Officially named the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. Its founding shareholders numbered 218. Its starting capital was £72,000. Its stated mandate was trade, but from its very earliest voyages, the company demonstrated a willingness to do whatever it took to protect its interests, including violence. Within decades, the company had established a series of trading posts along the coast of India. They called them factories: Surat, Madras, Bombay, Calcutta. Each one began as a foothold. Each one was quickly surrounded by fortifications, by walls, by armed guards, by the unmistakable architecture of an organization that was not merely trading, but preparing, because that is exactly what it was doing. The genius of the East India Company, and make no mistake, it was a form of genius, however monstrous its application, was that it operated with all the powers of a sovereign state while remaining answerable only to its shareholders. By the early 1700s, it had its own navy, its own army, what became known as the Company Army, which at its peak would number over 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British Army itself. It had its own diplomatic corps, its own intelligence network, its own courts, its own prisons, and it was making extraordinary amounts of money. The company had long since shifted its focus beyond spices. Indian textiles, cotton, silk, indigo, were flowing westward in volumes that were transforming European fashion and European industry. And later came tea, sourced from China through a trade arrangement of breathtaking cynicism. The company grew opium in India, sold it into China, and used the proceeds to buy tea for the British market. 3 continents, 1 supply chain, 0 accountability. The real turning point came in 1757. At the Battle of Plassey in Bengal, company forces under a man named Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal. The victory was achieved through a combination of military force and the strategic bribery of the Nawab's own generals, a betrayal arranged quietly in advance before a single shot was fired. The battle lasted barely a day. Its consequences lasted a century. The victory handed the company effective control over Bengal, one of the wealthiest, most productive regions in the entire world, and within a decade, the transformation was complete. The East India Company was no longer trading in India. It was governing it, collecting taxes, administering justice, commanding armies, making laws. It had become, in everything but the name on the door, an empire within an empire, a nation-state that answered to a board of directors in London rather than a parliament or a monarch. And for a time, it worked. Spectacularly, brutally, profitably, it worked. But power on this scale does not sustain itself without cost. And the cost, in this case, was paid by the people of India. In 1770, Bengal was struck by famine, a catastrophic failure of rains, combined with years of extractive taxation and trade policies that had systematically drained the region of its reserves, created conditions of almost unimaginable suffering. Estimates of the death toll vary. The most conservative figures suggest 1 million people died. Other historians place the number closer to 10 million, roughly a third of Bengal's entire population gone within 2 years. The company's response was at best indifference. Tax collection continued throughout the famine. Trade policies that disadvantaged local farmers remained in place, and the men in the London boardrooms, thousands of miles away, continued to receive their returns. Back in Britain, the voices of criticism were growing louder. Edmund Burke, the Irish statesman and political philosopher, launched a years-long campaign against the company and everything it represented. He argued with extraordinary force and eloquence that a private corporation could not be trusted to govern millions of people. That accountability to shareholders was not the same as accountability to humanity. His prosecution of Warren Hastings, the Governor General of India, became one of the defining political spectacles of the 18th century. The trial lasted 7 years. Hastings was ultimately acquitted, but the damage to the company's reputation and to the idea that it could be trusted to govern itself was permanent. The British government, which had for decades allowed the company to operate as an almost entirely independent power, began tightening its grip. A series of India Acts throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s transferred increasing oversight to the Crown. The company was slowly, reluctantly being brought to heel, but it was not yet finished. The final blow came not from a parliament, not from a philosopher, not from a rival empire. It came from within. In 1857, the Sepoys mutinied. Sepoys were Indian soldiers, hundreds of thousands of them, employed in the company's vast private army. They were the instrument through which the company had built and maintained its empire. Without them, none of it was possible. And in the spring of 1857, they rose up. The immediate trigger was, on the surface, almost absurdly specific. A rumor that new rifle cartridges had been greased with the fat of pigs and cows, deeply offensive to both Muslim and Hindu soldiers who were required to bite them before loading. But the cartridges were simply the match. The powder had been building for decades. Cultural insensitivity, broken promises, exploitative governance, the slow, grinding accumulation of humiliations that come when one people is ruled by another purely for profit. The uprising spread rapidly across northern and central India. Cities fell, garrisons were overwhelmed. For months, the company's grip on India genuinely trembled. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, brutally and comprehensively suppressed. But the British government had seen enough. In 1858, an act of parliament dissolved the East India Company entirely. Its territories, its armies, its courts, its prisons, all of it transferred directly to the British Crown. India became a possession of the British state rather than a possession of a corporation. The company's shareholders were compensated, its employees absorbed into the colonial administration. Its name, which had once inspired fear and commanded obedience from London to Calcutta, was quietly, unceremoniously retired. The most powerful commercial enterprise in human history was wound up by a vote in Parliament. It took less than an afternoon. The East India Company existed for 258 years. In that time, it transformed global trade, accelerated the Industrial Revolution, and laid the foundations, for better and catastrophically for worse, of the British Empire that would follow it. It pioneered the joint stock company model that every modern corporation is built upon. It demonstrated that private enterprise, given sufficient power and sufficient distance from accountability, could function as a nation-state, complete with armies, laws, and the authority of life and death over millions. And it showed, with a clarity that history has never quite managed to soften, what happens when profit becomes the only compass. When the balance sheet matters more than the lives it is built upon. The company began with 218 merchants, 72,000 pounds, and a request for permission to trade spices. It ended with the deaths of millions, the subjugation of a subcontinent, and a parliamentary vote to make it disappear. That is the rise and fall of the East India Company. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Throne and Ruin. Every week, another empire, another rise, another fall. I'll see you in the next one.